Hi, and welcome to Amicus. This is Slate's podcast about the courts, the law, the U.S. Supreme Court, the rule of law. I'm Dahlia Lithwick. That's my beat at Slate. On October 1st of 2017, a gunman opened fire from his suite in the Mandalay Bay Hotel in Las Vegas, firing more than 1,000 rounds on the crowd gathered below on the Strip for the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival. 60 people were killed, 413 were wounded, many with life-altering disabilities, and the ensuing panic brought the total number of injured to more than 860. It was the deadliest mass shooting by a single gunman in American history. And how was the shooter able to unleash this level of death and mayhem and carnage solo? Bump stocks. Bump stocks are devices that attach to semi-automatic rifles, enabling them to fire at similar rates to a machine gun. The Trump administration, let me say that one more time, the Trump administration enacted a bump stock ban in the wake of the Las Vegas massacre. At the time, President Trump described bump stocks as, quote, turning legal weapons into illegal machines.
I signed a memorandum directing the Attorney General to propose regulations to ban all devices that turn legal weapons into machine guns.
After extensive deliberation, the ATF decided that the devices fell under a long-standing ban on both machine guns and items that convert rifles into machine guns, and it ordered owners of bump stocks to destroy them or surrender them to the agency within 90 days. This past Friday, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a 6-3 majority opinion written by Justice Clarence Thomas, signed onto by the conservative justices in complete lockstep, overturned that ban. The court ruled that as a matter of pure statutory construction, the administration had exceeded its power in prohibiting the sale and possession of bump stocks as machine guns. As Justice Sonia Sotomayor noted in a dissent that she read from the bench on Friday, quote, today's decision to reject that ordinary understanding will have deadly consequences. The majority's artificially narrow definition hamstrings the government's efforts to keep machine guns from gunmen like the Las Vegas shooter, end quote. Just as an aside, the challenger in this particular litigation was Michael Cargill, a gun shop owner in Texas who returned his bump stocks after the ban went into effect, then challenged the ban. Cargill was backed by the New Civil Liberties Alliance, an advocacy group with financial ties to Charles Koch, who has paid for at least one undisclosed junket to the Bohemian Grove at which high donors could hear and meet with Clarence Thomas. Oh, and that's the same Clarence Thomas who authored the 6-3 opinion. Cargill delivered a victory lap on social media on Friday.
Breaking news. I did it. Michael Cargill versus Merrick Garland. The Department of Justice, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the bump stock lawsuit. I beat them in the United States Supreme Court. As always, more guns equals less crime. You go out there and you buy yourself a gun. Better yet, get yourself a bump stock.
Joining us to discuss what it is that happened in this bump stock case are Mark Joseph Stern, senior writer with me here at Slate, covering the courts and the law and the bastion of Amicus's Opinionpalooza coverage. Hi again, Mark.
Hi, Dahlia.
Also joining us is David Pucino, legal director and deputy chief counsel at Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. Welcome to Amicus, David.
Thanks very much for having me.
David, I guess I want to start with you because this entire lawsuit and the opinion that came down Friday turns on the definition of a machine gun under the National Firearms Act of 1934. And I would love it if you could just set the table for us by talking about the history of that legislation and how it's been enforced since.
Sure. So the statute at issue here is called the National Firearms Act, the first major piece of federal firearms legislation, the oldest. And it was enacted in the 1930s in response to a lot of firearms being used in organized crime. So it was designed as a piece of law that was going to address the problem of gangster crime, gangster-driven crime, and particular machine guns. Over the course of the ensuing decades, what we saw was folks looking at this law that said you can't have a machine gun and trying to find ways to get around it. And so we had a few different instances where Congress revisited this law and said, you can't get around this. And the most salient one for this particular lawsuit is one of the changes that was made said, we're going to define as a machine gun, not just the firearm that actually shoots automatically, but also any device that can convert a weapon into being a firearm that shoots automatically. And so those devices, anything that's a conversion device to shoot automatically, that's going to itself be counted as a machine gun. In 1986, Congress enacted a law that said any machine gun created after this date, after 1986, cannot be used in civilian hands. Civilians can't have them. They grandfathered in. They had a legacy clause to bring in anything before 1986 that could still be possessed under stricter regulations, but anything after that, no. And so what we had here then was another round of companies trying to get around the clear law that said you can't have machine guns, and created a device that allows for a firearm to fire automatically. But there was a claim that this was somehow evading the law. And so the Supreme Court here is interpreting not just that law, but that history, that those subsequent enactments, and kind of throwing all that out and maybe passing the buck and saying, we're going to look at the really statutory language here and interpret it in a tortured way, I think, in order to come to the outcome that the gun industry was looking for, which is saying that the actions the Trump administration took to address these really dangerous components is not valid anymore.
And David, I just want to ask you about something Justice Sotomayor brought up in her dissent, which is that back in 1934, when Congress was enacting this law, machine guns fired in different ways, right? There were different mechanisms by which machine guns operated. And so Congress came in with a sweeping, pretty broad definition of what counted because they wanted to capture all of these guns and avoid loopholes in the future, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the language that Congress used is a weapon that fires automatically with a single function of the trigger. And the court was really looking a lot at the word function, both in Justice Thomas's opinion and also at oral argument. Justice Gorsuch harped on this a lot at oral argument. And if you look back at the history, and if you look even at Justice Sotomayor's dissent, because she really gets into this in a really elucidating way, there were different ways to fire a machine gun. Some of them had a trigger that we traditionally think of. That's that curved piece of metal. Some of them had buttons. There were other ways to activate these machine guns because there simply were devices that were going to be firing bullets until you stopped. And so why use function? Well, you use the term function there because you can't use pull, because you want to also capture the button. And it was actually the NRA that suggested that term, the term function, in order to capture all of those potential uses. So that phrase that was used in 1934, single function of the trigger, was intended to be broad and to encapsulate everything. And then the court here kind of flipped that on its head by trying to use this language, torture it a bit, I think, to say that only triggers can function. People don't function triggers. Triggers are functioned on. Difference between a transitive and intransitive verb. And on that very narrow grammatical, and I think really hard to justify basis, grammatical reading, that you follow that the statutory language that was meant to be interpreted very broadly is now going to be interpreted narrowly.
And David, can you just, in order to kind of get us all caught up, tell listeners who don't know what a bump stock is, what a bump stock is, why it was created, and how it was regulated before 2017, and maybe just to the extent that, as I understand it, bump stocks were created not just to evade, as you said, regulations, but to make it easier if you had like a weak grip to fire off multiple rounds, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is the justification that was used is the weak grip. I think that's something that we see a lot from the industry. They'll create a product that is clearly designed to evade the law, to allow you to do something like have the fun or whatever of shooting automatically without having to deal with the laws that say you can't do that. And they need to come up with a justification to explain, well, why are we selling this product? What's this thing for? And so always you see some explanation. Now, there might be some instances where somebody who has certain disabilities might benefit from certain products, but that is not the purpose. That's not while they're out there. That's the ad hoc after the fact justification. And we see this also with a product called pistol braces. But I'll get into that in a second. To circle back to what is a bump stock. A bump stock is a device that you attach to a semi-automatic rifle. So take an AR-style rifle. It replaces the stationary stock, which is the part of the rifle that goes against your shoulder. So you're firing a rifle, you're going to be firing that from your shoulder. And what the bump stock does is it allows the upper assembly of this rifle to move back and forth while you're firing. It harnesses the recoil of the explosion. I mean, the way a gun works is you're setting off an explosion within the gun and the bullet's coming out. So it's harnessing the recoil from that explosion, from the bullet going out, to allow the firearm to slide back and forth. So instead of a person pulling their trigger finger repeatedly in order to fire a gun, the whole gun is now moving back and forth. So from the perspective of a shooter, you can just compress your finger, put some forward pressure on the gun, and it's going to fire automatically until you've emptied your entire magazine. In the same way that would happen if you were firing a fully automatic, traditionally manufactured machine gun. And so the difference here is that instead of the recoil being harnessed and used inside the gun in order to cycle the weapon and allow it to fire continuously, it's happening outside the gun through the mechanism of this bump stock that allows it to slide back and forth.
You actually said, David, that you would loop back to this question of what it means to have a weak grip and what it means to try to create workarounds for that in the gun industry.
There's a rule, actually, this one from the Biden administration, not the Trump administration, that I think really encapsulates this dynamic as well. Going back to the National Firearms Act again, that's the law that's defining machine guns. That law also defines as restricted weapons short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns. And that was because those were also weapons that were really being used in organized crime at the time and that Congress wanted to address. And so if you have a rifle, a weapon that's designed to be fired from your shoulder, that's what a rifle is, and it's short enough that it's easily to conceal because the barrel is very short, that's going to be subject to really close regulation by the federal government in a similar way that a machine gun is. And so the gun industry, wanting to seek out loopholes to be able to put these products on the street despite them being illegal, came up with a workaround, which is that they designed a product, they called it a pistol brace. So pistol braces are real, to be clear. Pistol brace means it's an attachment to a handgun to allow you to have it stabilized on your arm. So you have the pistol in your hand, and some people, it's difficult to fire a pistol from their hand because of disabilities, injuries, otherwise. So this will clamp onto your forearm and to stabilize the pistol as you use it, a legitimate use. But they would design these pistol braces, so they called the products pistol braces, but their actual use was to convert the pistol into a rifle. So the function of this pistol brace wasn't to attach to your forearm. It was to provide a flat surface on the back of the firearm that you could put up against your shoulder. That is very clearly, if a weapon is used that way, that's a short-barreled rifle. That's not a pistol. And so what you had was an evasion of the law. But the justification for it was in this grounds of looking at people with disabilities, making it the use of firearms more accessible. But that actually wasn't the function. And ATF put out a rule to distinguish between those two things, those legitimate pistol braces that are used by people with disabilities to be able to fire handguns, and those illegitimate products that are designed to convert a pistol into an illegal short-barreled rifle. And that's also been challenged by the gun industry, despite the fact that ATF did very careful and exacting work to try to distinguish that legitimate and lawful use from that illegitimate and illegal one.
Can you talk about the rate of fire of a semi-automatic rifle versus a bump stock equipped rifle?
Absolutely. So if you look at a standard AR-15, an ordinary person is going to be firing that weapon about 1 round a second, about 60 rounds per minute. Somebody who's an absolute professional, top of the game, trains to do it as fast as possible, can get that up to maybe 180 rounds per minute. But if you put a bump stock on there, you're now between 400 and 800 rounds a minute. And that's going to be equal to the rate from an M16, a standard issue machine gun that would be used by the armed forces. For there, you're looking at 700 to 950 rounds a minute.
And maybe just to state the obvious, what use would a civilian conceivably have to fire at 800 rounds a minute?
I mean, the use case here is horrifically the 1 October shooting in Las Vegas. The use for that is to fire a large number of bullets in a short period of time to inflict massive carnage. And a bump stock, because this gun is sliding back and forth, the upper assembly is sliding back and forth, you lose accuracy. So the self-defense usage there is made worse by the bump stock being on there. What's made better is your ability to put out a ton of bullets sprayed in a short period of time. It's that scenario, the mass violence scenario, the shooting into a crowd scenario.
We're going to take a short break to hear from our sponsors.
It's hard to imagine a world where we leave future generations with fewer rights and freedoms. The Supreme Court has stolen the constitutional right to control our bodies. Now politicians in nearly every state have introduced bills that would block people from getting the essential sexual and reproductive care they need, including abortion. Planned Parenthood believes everyone deserves access to care. It's a human right. We won't give up and we won't back down. Help ensure the next generation can decide their own futures. Donate to Planned Parenthood. Visit plannedparenthood.org/future.
Cat mummies, cat daddies, we know you're totally obsessed with your cat. I am totally obsessed with my cat, Arby. But the least fun part of that is the struggle to keep their litter box clean. Have you heard about Litter Robot? You never need to scoop again. It is the solution to all of your cat litter problems. Comes with self-cleaning technology that automatically cleans after every use. You get updates about whether it's time to refill the box or change the litter bag drawer. So truly, you can detach detach from your relationship with your litter box and have a deeper relationship with your cat. Whisker is currently offering $50 off litter robot bundles. As a special offer to listeners of this show, go to stopscooping.com/amicus and use promo code amicus to save an additional $50 on any litter robot bundle. That's $100 off any litter robot bundle at stopscooping.com/amicus and use promo code amicus. Stopscooping.com/amicus, promo code amicus. More now on Friday's bump stock decision with David Pucino from Giffords Law Center and our very own Mark Joseph Stern. One of the things that's notable in Justice Thomas's opinion is he kind of lays out the utter, it seems as though he's saying the utter insanity of Congress wanting to respond to the Las Vegas massacre, that there was all this pressure and mayhem, and, Congress couldn't do anything, and the ATF takes it upon itself to do something. All this sounds like it's like some kind of crazed overreaction. And then, Mark, this showed up both in your piece at oral argument and again in your piece Friday. The claim is that the ATF did a complete 180 on how it considered bump stocks under this rubric of whether or not they're a machine gun, and suddenly they changed their minds. And your point, I think, is that that's just not true.
Yeah, this really surprised me when I was digging into the history here. This idea that ATF said, no, bump stocks are 100% legal. We've got no problem with them. And then suddenly, in response to political pressure, turned around and said, wait, these have been unlawful all along. We have to ban them. That is such a misrepresentation of the history here. What really happened is that gun makers were developing various kinds of tools that helped to make semi-automatic rifles fire at a higher rates. ATF looked at some of them and said they were potentially legal, looked at some of them and said they were unlawful on a case-by-case basis without making a formal determination at the agency level. And some of them were sort of snuck in by, as David said, sent to ATF as something for a disabled person who has a weak grip, and then marketed as the next best thing to a machine gun. And so when ATF decided to take a holistic look at this and issue a regulation after the Las Vegas shooting, I mean, that to me is doing what an agency is supposed to do. Look at the facts on the ground, look at your mandate from Congress, look at your own past decisions, harmonize them as best you can in accordance with what the experts who staff your agency say the law means and what the facts are. And so, to see Thomas not only sort of slander ATF as caving to political pressure, but overruling the determination of ATF's own firearm experts, it seemed to me not only the height of arrogance, but also a perfect example of the conservative justices on this court spurning agency experts and the executive branch more broadly and saying that we, unelected, unaccountable judges, know better than you guys on the ground in the executive branch who are ultimately accountable to the people.
Mark, I think that's such a great point. And the points you made in your piece about the way in which there was really careful work going on at ATF to make these determinations on a case-by-case basis. I mean, I think that is really essential to understand what an agency is trying to do when they're faced with the problem here, which is you've got folks in the industry trying to get around the laws that you have on the books. You come out and you say, this is what the law is. They're going to try to get around it. Did they succeed or not? Can they get around it? And in this case, as you noted, it's based on deception that they're able to do that. But what I think that is really striking here is that whole process, doing that engagement, the Supreme Court has usurped that here in a way that is totally unworkable if you applied it beyond the favored political constituency of the gun industry. It's really absurd to have the Supreme Court going and taking its time and putting all of this work into deciding the mechanics of a firearm and whether it meets the statute and trying to overrule an agency that made those same determinations. That's not a workable way to do government. And if you had to do it in every instance, I mean, if you had every regulatory decision that was made in this country that might have gone one way or might have gone the other go up to the Supreme Court, it's not just all they would be doing. You'd need 100 Supreme Courts, 1,000 of them to be doing that. The volume of work that comes out of the administrative state is not something that the Supreme Court can analyze in this way in any sort of reasonable way. And I don't think they would ever even pretend to. But what you have is you have a particular favored constituency that is bringing these questions. And then all of a sudden, well, yeah, we're going to drop everything and figure out how this gun works. And not only that, when we say figure out what this gun works, now the way ATF does that, they're going to sit down and they're going to look at the firearm, they're going to bring in their experts, and they're going to make those determinations. The way the Supreme Court does it is they look at an amicus brief from the Firearms Policy Coalition and co-sign it.
David, you talked about, in response to Mark's question about what it means to be able to fire off, huge rounds because you've added a bump stock to the game. But I would just love for you to take one beat and tell listeners what that means in terms of lethality at the other end. I mean, can you just give us some sense of what, because my mind doesn't fully understand beyond Las Vegas as the sort of template, what we're talking about when you're operating a gun with a bump stock.
The difference between semi-automatic and automatic fire can be really, really extensive in terms of the damage that the weapon can do. Part of the reason why Congress initially wanted to ban machine guns is that they were the weapon of choice by organized crime at the time. And what that would mean is that somebody who was trying to assassinate another a rival gang member, would go out and would spray them with bullets, and the bystanders be damned. You'd have that circumstance where innocent bystanders are going to be hit by the spray of bullets, because the way these weapons are designed is they're going to spray all the bullets that they can until you stop pulling the trigger, and you're going to empty your magazine. And that's what we see on the street all the time with automatic fire. Inexperienced, untrained people who pull up with automatic weapons, and they empty their entire magazine, and sometimes they'll hit their target, sometimes they won't. They'll certainly send a lot of bullets into the community, and sometimes those bullets are going to hit and kill innocent bystanders, including children. We see that all the time. And the bump stock is simply another vehicle, some other mechanism to do that. Now, what is the reason why somebody would want one of these things? Like, what is the other side of that? I think it's hard to see any possible reason that isn't either wanting to have the recreational fun experience of what it would be like to shoot a machine gun or mass murder.
The entire fight, in some sense, in at least Justice Thomas's opinion, comes down to this word function and trying to determine what function modifies. The question, as I understand it, tell me if I'm wrong, is now really whether the finger is being regulated or the gun itself. Thomas comes down on the side that what is being modified here with function is the finger and not the trigger. And I would love for you, David, and then you, Mark, to just help me understand how it is. Because as you said, David, function was understood to mean something for a very long time, and certainly at the drafting, how Clarence Thomas gets himself to the place where function is only talking about the finger.
I've said the word tortured a few times, and I think that's really the only way to look at the reading that the Supreme Court applied here. So let's take it at its face. There's two ways you can interpret this. Either Congress is writing a statute, and what they're really concerned about is how many times, from the perspective of a trigger, is the trigger compressed? If you could imagine yourself being a trigger, how many times are you going back and forth when a single round is fired? How many rounds are coming out when you're moving back and forth once? The other thing is, as the perspective of a shooter, what do you have to do in order to fire more than one round? So automatic fire is going to be more than one round with one action by the shooter under that perspective. And semi-automatic fire is going to be only one shot fired with you doing something. So the question is it the person doing something or the trigger doing something? And I think the only possible reasonable thing you could even imagine anybody in 1934 thinking this statute meant was what the person was doing. But the Supreme Court here, in order to come out with this opinion that is going to strike down that common sense understanding, says, no, actually everybody really is all about the trigger. And the reading to get there is to look at the word function and to say, usually people aren't functioning. There's things that are being functioned upon. So it's the object that's being functioned upon, the function of the trigger. And I just don't think that really holds up if you think about it at all. We talked about this at the top, that really, why use the word function? I mean, it is maybe a kind of awkward piece of language to be used, but the reason to use it is because not all triggers are things that you pull. So the word that they came up with was function. It's just a real step out on a limb to say that there was anything else going on there, but it's jumping off the limb to say actually what must have meant was that it was about the perspective of the trigger.
And Justice Sotomayor, again, in her dissent, includes excerpts from the congressional debate around this, where people are describing this the way that you did, David, that it's a person pulling a trigger. The function definition that Clarence Thomas pulls out of nowhere, out of the, gun group's briefs, basically, is incredibly technical and narrow to the point that it's hard to imagine why Congress would have enacted that, even back in 1934, when arguably, even then, it wouldn't encompass the precise kind of machine guns that legislators were attempting to ban. I mean, I think you're using very diplomatic language, going out on a limb and all of that. I mean, torturing it almost seems like an understatement to me. It strikes me that Justice Thomas is defying the plain language of the statute, something Sotomayor accuses him of doing, and in pursuit of what's very clearly an agenda. I struggle to see any legitimate basis for the court taking this ultra nitpicky, narrow, artificial reading other than just kind of a general desire to flood the country with bump stocks.
It's not really very easy to separate this case from a big sort of sub-theme of the term, which is we're going to make it impossible for agencies to do anything or to make up their own minds about anything. And I'm just wondering, when you have Clarence Thomas substituting judgment for the entire ATF, all of its fact-finding, all of its deep, deep understanding of this issue with what I guess gets called, quote, 6 graphics and an animation. I know everything I know because here's like a Peanuts comic that I read about it. There's a way in which it's attempting to sort of almost explain. I mean, this is very readable by the public, but it also, in making it very accessible through these graphics, sort of elides what is being swept away in terms of agency expertise.
Yeah, the concept that you can get out of reading a brief, the amount of expertise that goes into the technical determinations made by ATF, I mean, obviously, of course not. The amount of time that even clerks who are really going to do a deep dive on these issues, the like depth of understanding they're going to be able to come away with is not going to come anywhere near something that an expert who's working on this full time, this is their whole job, this is what they're hired to do, this is what they're trained to do, this is what they're going to do. It's not a possible thing. But I want to pick back up, I think, on what Mark's point was, is that even if you leave aside the process thing, it's really hard to imagine how this possibly could have been the correct interpretation by the court. You know, Justice Sotomayor in her dissent is raising the canons about evasions of the law, and it's she cites to Justice Scalia and Brian Garner's book about the canons and tenets of the law, and calls it the presumption against ineffectiveness. What you have here is a question about whether we're going to allow folks to come up with their one weird trick to get around federal law. And I think it's pretty clear that you should assume that probably the one weird trick doesn't work. You should probably assume that if Congress was sitting down and writing the law and knowing about the one weird trick, they probably would have tried to include it in the statute they were covering. And so what you have is Justice Thomas in this opinion, not just trying to play firearms expert, but coming to the wrong decision that says we're going to actually go ahead and allow all kinds of loopholes into our law. And what I think it does more than that is it invites people to explore and find these loopholes. What this opinion is, it's an invitation to the gun industry to look at every gun law in the books and try to figure out any weird little way you can get around the most technical, strained reading of it. And if you can do that, then, you know, the door's open to you. You've got all these sales coming in the books because nobody's going to be able to stop you, because the Supreme Court is going to stop the law enforcement agency from enforcing the law.
Mark, I want to ask you exactly the same question, which is, there's a moment in Justice Sotomayor's dissent where she, again, is just imploring her colleagues to read the text. And she says, quote, "Every member of the majority has previously emphasized that the best way to respect congressional intent is to adhere to the ordinary understanding of the terms Congress uses." And then she just goes down, boom, 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 in order of seniority, because she's respectful, every justice, and quotes them saying essentially that. And it really is, I guess, as David says, there is one trick to getting around the plain meaning, and every single one of the 6 justices in the majority seems awfully inclined to take that exit ramp.
And it really makes you wonder what the point of textualism is, if textualism can lead to this result. Because as I said, and as David said, you read the majority opinion and maybe then you read the dissent and you say, why did they do this? What is the purpose? And to me, at least, I can only assume they wanted to. You know, you could really only justify Thomas's reading, in my view, if you start from the conclusion that this ban is unlawful and you work your way backwards and you butcher the text to mean something that it doesn't say, that's fundamentally ahistorical, that isn't how ordinary people use the English language, and isn't how members of Congress who voted on this law used the English language when they wrote it in 19 1934. And if textualism can be deployed in this way, underhanded, cynical, I think it's not really getting us anywhere. It's not a helpful tool of interpretation. It's just another way for the Supreme Court to justify, toss out whatever pretext it needs to reach a certain result. And that is depressing, right? Because I think there have been decisions like Bostock versus Clayton County where some of the conservatives will say, hey, look, textualism isn't always jury-rigged to lead to the Republicans' favorite outcome. Sometimes textualism really does lead to, a place that we as Republican appointees might not personally prefer. And this just seemed to shatter that. And to have Justice Thomas write it too, and this is something we haven't discussed, presumably the Chief Justice was in the majority and assigned this to Thomas. He knew that Thomas would write the most extreme version of this, the least empathetic version of this. It's so callous that even Justice Alito feels compelled to write separately to say, oh, by the way, the Las Vegas massacre was bad. Something you wouldn't necessarily think that the majority even believes from reading its opinion, right? Alito says, oh, mass shootings are bad. I at least think that they are bad, and Congress could do something about them, but we aren't going to let the executive branch and ATF do anything about them for now. And I just find it to be one of those really cynicism-inducing moments. It feels like the mask has come off the conservative supermajority, and they are 100% results-oriented, and you can just see the way that they have formulated their reasonings starting from the conclusion that guns good, gun restrictions bad.
David, I'm looking at all our faces on the Zoom as we tape this, and we're just like all galactically bummed. And I would love it if you would do the thing that really needs doing, which is to tell us what Cargill doesn't do, what didn't happen in Friday's ruling, because actually, and it's really important, and I should have started with this, this isn't a Second Amendment ruling. This doesn't in any way, I think, change our understanding of the Second Amendment. And B, at least at some level, as Mark just said, Sam Alito says, Congress, you can fix this tomorrow.
Yeah, I think, the most important point is that it is not a Second Amendment case. And in Justice Alito's concurrence, if Congress can do it tomorrow, that means that there's no Second Amendment problem with doing it. So I think that is a really important thing to highlight. And it's not just because Congress can and obviously should act. It's that the states can too. And we actually have seen a number of states already do this. We've got somewhere in the neighborhood of 16, 17 states that have taken action on bump stocks and they're not legal in those states, even after this decision. And other states should follow that route and do it. I think the only reason not to have passed a law like that at the state level is because it was redundant to the federal law, but that's not the case any longer. And so I think if you're a state lawmaker who cares about public safety in your constituency, who does not want to have a horrific event on the magnitude of the 1 October shooting happen in your jurisdiction, that's something that you should do right away. You've got to prioritize that. But the real solution will be, as many problems created by the Supreme Court here, is for Congress to stand up and act. The Justice Alito suggests that the court doing here is merely passing the buck. Now, that's not what they're doing. The problem was solved. ATF came out and said, we figured out how to deal with this problem. We've looked at it. We've studied it carefully, and these products are machine guns. Supreme Court is reversing that. Justice Alito is pretending that their hands were tied. I don't think that they were for all the reasons that we've been talking about here today. But what is clear is that Congress can now fix this problem, and they need to.
I totally agree Congress can fix this problem. I think that this Supreme Court, even these justices, would uphold a ban that was explicitly enacted by Congress. But I just want to add, I'm not sure that Clarence Thomas would, because, Clarence Thomas's view about what guns should and must be legal, it's both originalist and anti-originalist. He says, well, any gun regulation has to be rooted in history and tradition and have an analog from 1791. But also, any arms that are in common use today automatically gain constitutional protection. So once gun makers have flooded the country with a sufficient number of some arms, then they become, in Clarence Thomas's view, Second Amendment rights for people to buy and own and make. And as some of the conservatives noted at oral arguments, hundreds of thousands of Americans now own bump stocks. The gun makers were able, through these loopholes, to slip through a whole lot of bump stocks. And I think there's a real chance that Clarence Thomas, if this came back, and maybe a few others, maybe Neil Gorsuch, would say, actually, so many people have now obtained these that we think they've gained constitutional stature. Again, I don't think all the conservatives would do that, but it shows just how reckless and dangerous and wacky Clarence Thomas's Second Amendment jurisprudence is that what gun makers can essentially do is conspire to carve loopholes through the law, sneak stuff past ATF, maybe win some friendly cases on statutory interpretation like this one, and then magically bestow constitutional protection to some incredibly dangerous weapon or equipment that converts something into a weapon. It's no way to do law, and it's no way to, I think, interpret a constitution that's anything but a suicide pact.
Time now for a short break to hear from our sponsors on this week's show. This episode is brought to you by ZBiotics. There's a new game-changing product to use before a night out with drinks. It's called ZBiotics. Let's face it, after a night with drinks, it's tough to bounce back the next day. You have to make a choice. You can either have a great night or a great next day. ZBiotics is a surefire way to wake up feeling fresh after a night of drinking. ZBiotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. ZBiotics produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make ZBiotics your first drink of the night, drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. Go to zbiotics.com/amicus to get 15% off your first order. When you use Amicus at checkout, ZBiotics is backed with a 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/amicus and use the code AMICUS at checkout for 15% off.
This episode is brought to you by ZBiotics. Let's face it, after a night with drinks, it's tough to bounce back the next day. You have to make a choice. You can either have a great night or a great next day. ZBiotics is a surefire way to wake up feeling fresh after a night of drinking. ZBiotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. ZBiotics produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make ZBiotics your first drink of the night, drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. Go to zbiotics.com/slate to get 15% off your first order when you use SLATE at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/slate and use the code SLATE at checkout for 15% off.
More now on Friday's bump stock decision with David Pucino from Giffords Law Center and our very own Mark Joseph Stern. One of the things that I think is grim, you've both flicked at versions of this in the conversation, is that even the world since 2017 is different from this world that we now live in, both because, as I think you said, David, gun manufacturers are doubling down to say, oh, this is safe, this is great, this is just so that people with weak grips can use guns. The other thing that is grim, I think, and bears mentioning is that Donald Trump himself, this was his signature piece of gun legislation, and at least based on the statement that came out after the decision on Friday, he applauds the Supreme Court's decision eviscerating his own signature gun legislation. So I guess I just want to throw open to the both of you the ways in which this is not a net neutral, because the ground has changed significantly even since the bump stock ban. And also because, I hate to say it now, I'm going to be even grimmer than Mark, we're careening into an election where we're seeing sort of the language of violence and stochastic terror and, vigilantism everywhere.
I think the flip-flop from former President Trump on this issue is one of the most predictable things you could see. I mean, this is not the first time he's had an opportunistic flip-flop. It's not even the first time he's done it on the gun issue. I mean, after Parkland, he came out and said he wanted to do all of this work, and then the NRA lobbyist stopped by and he changed his tune. And I think it's hard not to see the similar action happening here. But I think the bigger picture is exactly what you were saying about the way in which the ground is shifting, because it's not one of the most cowardly politicians of our time flipping on an issue. What it is the gun industry itself becoming more and more extreme. I mean, the NRA, when this regulation first was promulgated, was supportive, of doing something about bump stocks, and now they're against it. And part of this is part of the story, I think, is the relative decline of the NRA, with all of the corruption that has been exposed in recent years, with the massive loss that they received in the case against Attorney General James. I mean, this is an organization that is diminished in its capacity, still has far too much influence in our politics, to be sure, but is not the NRA that it used to be. And that's created a vacuum. It's created a gap. And what has gone into the gap are a bunch of further right organizations that are trying to take the mantle of the NRA by being as extreme as possible. And I think foremost among those is the Firearm Policy Coalition. You kind of have to take a step back and look at where we are, that this group, which if folks aren't aware, is one of the most extreme. Their rhetoric is extraordinarily violent, and they are putting in material that's getting blessed by a majority opinion of the Supreme Court. I don't think that's anything that you could imagine happening even 20 years ago, 10 years ago.
Mark, do you want to weigh in for a moment on the gun case that is coming, which is Rahimi, and on ghost guns, and on anything else that we can look at on the horizon that is built of gloom today?
Sure. Little good news or optimism. I still think that the Supreme Court is going to uphold the federal law that prohibits domestic abusers from owning firearms by a lopsided majority. Unfortunately, I think gullible members of the media and conservative activists will frame that decision as mitigating the damage of this one somehow, or showing that this court is in a mood for compromise or moderation on firearms. That is not true. I think they're just trying to rein in their own extreme decision in Bruin 2 years ago that unleashed madness like the Fifth Circuit decision, giving domestic abusers the constitutional right to bear arms. But some of these future cases, like the ghost guns restriction that the Biden administration has imposed, or the closure of the gun show loophole that the Biden administration is trying to close, but which federal judges keep blocking, I don't think this decision bodes well for those at all. I mean, what this decision says is that the Supreme Court is going to start these statutory interpretation cases with an emphatically pro-gun stance, with a fixation on reaching a pro-gun outcome however possible, and then torment and tease the text until it says what they want it to say, even if it really obviously doesn't. I think that's true of both of those cases, ghost guns and the gun show loophole. I'd like to believe that maybe, John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett just thought this was a hard case. During oral arguments, it certainly sounded like Amy Coney Barrett thought it was a hard case. She was really asking great questions that made it sound like she understood this play on the function of the trigger and how the gun groups were trying to kind of twist it to mean something it didn't. And yet she just silently signed on to Clarence Thomas's opinion. And yet at the same time, Amy Coney Barrett and John Roberts provided the fourth and fifth votes to allow one of the Biden administration's ghost gun regulations to take effect. So we're getting really mixed signals. I'm not excited to see these cases land on the Supreme Court's merits docket. I'm actually quite concerned about it. But, I think that when it comes to reining in some of the extremes and excesses of Bruin, the Supreme Court's going to have to say, well, we didn't quite mean that, because when you have lower courts giving known violent criminals a right to use arms, something has gone horribly awry, and even a handful of the conservative justices can recognize that.
Same question for you, David. What are you looking at on the horizon?
Well, I think all eyes have to be on that Rahimi decision, and I agree with Mark. I don't see how you could possibly have an opinion that goes the other way. It's just such an obvious question, and if there's a decision that says that domestic abusers have to be able to be armed, that we can't take them away from them, I don't know what we're doing here. So I think that is going to be a decision that the Supreme Court does the right thing on. It really has to be. It's unthinkable to me that you would have a scenario where they're putting our most vulnerable people at risk in that way. On the the Vanderstock case that Mark mentioned. So this is the case about the Biden administration's rulemaking saying that ghost gun parts are firearms and have to be treated that way. I think Mark is right to be concerned that the very tortured readings that we have in the Cargill case here suggest that you could have motivated reasoning, the tail wagging the dog. But I think that case is very different. The language there, I think, is really strong and clear. I don't think there are these kinds of grammatical functioning sort of thing. I mean, it's not to say that you couldn't do that work with the statute at issue in the Vanderstock case, but we'd have to come up with another metaphor because I think it would go beyond torture.
And Mark, I just want to turn to you in the blizzard of what is to come in 2 weeks, theoretically, if the court is going to keep its schedule. We got 3 decisions on Friday. We got one as a bankruptcy case, one's an immigration case. There's still, again, depending on how you count, 22, 23 cases to come. I guess Thursday is the next opinions day. What does it mean? I know we talk about this all the time, that the court has so many huge cases that the delays in getting to these cases are extraordinary, right? Rahimi, we've been waiting since November when that case was heard. In terms of democracy, in terms of the law, in terms of the court managing its own docket, while it is just being, I guess I have to note again for news purposes, constantly shelled with reporting suggesting that at least some of the justices writing these opinions are not disclosing lavish trips and gifts from people with vested interests in the outcomes. Mark, what does it all mean?
I'm just going to keep beating this drum forever. The Supreme Court is greedily gobbling up way more cases than it can take. It's taking on cases like the Chevron deference conflict. That's not a real conflict. That's not even a real case because the conservative supermajority has an agenda. They have items on their wish list that they want to check off, and they want to do it as quickly as possible. You never know when that 6-3 majority could become 5-4 or even flip altogether. And so they are snowed under with way too many major cases, even as they refuse to take the smaller cases involving actual law that used to make up most of the Supreme Court's docket. Credit Steve Vladeck for crunching the numbers here and showing that beyond any shadow of a doubt. And some cases that are very time sensitive just keep getting put off. The racial gerrymandering case, the state had asked for a decision months ago. It didn't come down. The presidential immunity case, we now know that Donald Trump is not going to have a trial for his crimes related to January 6th before the election because the Supreme Court waited even just to take up the case and then took it up and put it on a not very expedited timeline when you compare it to something like the ballot removal case where the Supreme Court acted as quickly as possible to put Trump back on the Colorado ballot. So, yeah, they are about to start pummeling us with these blockbuster decisions. Normal people will not be able to keep up. They will be overwhelming the news cycle. Somebody who has to work 2 jobs, somebody who has a bunch of kids and insufficient childcare, but who cares about these issues and is a citizen who wants to stay informed, is just not going to be able to absorb all of the garbage that's about to be dumped on our heads. And I think that's profoundly unfortunate. I think it's very intentional by the justices. I think they love overwhelming the news cycle, especially right before July 4th, right? When everything sort of disappears and gets reset. And I think it's bad for democracy because these guys are already unaccountable. And the problem is made so much worse when people can't fully pay attention to and absorb what they're doing because they're manipulating their docket and their calendar to ensure that all of this stuff happens all at once when most people just can't pay attention.
David, you can either weigh in on this, or if there's not what to be said on this, I guess I would also just really love to, following from Mark's answer before, I'd love to hear you tell listeners who think about, sensible gun regulations, who worry about sending their kids to school, who worry about going to festivals and rock concerts in a world of bump stocks. They're busy, they're tired, there's a lot going on. What are things that people can do who feel as though there's no point doing all this organizing and activism and advocacy if at the end of the day, Justice Clarence Thomas just gets to go, no?
I think it could be really hard on a day like this and, in the wake of horrific shootings, to try to think about doing this work, trying to make our communities safer, trying to make sure that the scourge of gun violence is something that we face less of in the future and maybe someday can close the door on entirely. But I don't think that despite how hard these days can be, it means that we should stop fighting. I think we need to double down our efforts. The thing I think about here is that in the summer of 2022, right after we got the Bruen decision, it really threw open the door to all kinds of litigation that the gun industry was bringing and put a lot of our gun laws into question. We also had Congress coming together and passing a generational gun safety law in the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. So the fact that we are facing difficulties doesn't mean that we can't also secure wins. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. And I think the other thing is to focus on the kind of wins that can happen at the state level. I mean, the federal government needs to do more on guns, unquestionably, but we can achieve a lot of important victories at the state level. And I think those state level bump stock laws are a great example of this. Congress has not done what they need to do and to pass a law to address the problem of gun stocks. They should do it. But in the meantime, the states are able to take important steps to keep their own communities safe. And that's something where as an individual, as an activist, you can have your voice heard and have it be reflected in the laws in the state that you live under.
Mark Joseph Stern covers the law, the courts, the Constitution, and democracy here at Slate, and he is an invaluable, I would say, MVP member of the Opinionpalooza team. And David Pucino is legal director and deputy chief counsel at the Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. David, Mark, maybe not our sunniest show, but certainly one that I think is appropriately sober on a day that really, really feels quite heartbreaking for a lot of us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dahlia.
Thanks for having me.
And that is a wrap for this episode of Amicus, the Gloomy Horizon edition. Thank you so much for listening in. Thank you so much for your letters and for your questions. You can always keep in touch at amicus@slate.com, or you can find us at facebook.com/Amicus Podcast. Sarah Birmingham is Amicus's senior producer. Our producer is Patrick Fort. Alicia Montgomery is vice president of audio at Slate. Susan Matthews is Slate's executive editor, and Ben Richmond is our senior director of operations. We'll be back with another episode of Amicus next week, and until then, hang on in there.
For the ones who know safety isn't a catchphrase, it's a culture. And the ones who help make sure everyone makes it home safe. For the safety-minded who watch everyone's backs, Grainger offers supplies and solutions for every industry, as well as safety assessments and training to keep your facilities safe and your people safer. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.